Hello, my name is Ed Frawley. I own Leerburg. A couple of weeks ago, Greg Van Kuren, the owner of Educator Remote Collars, and I did kind of a humorous video about a very serious subject, and that is using remote collars as a training tool with our dogs. We did that because we felt that a little humor goes a long way in getting people to listen to what we have to say about remote collars. It worked because we had over 700 and some shares on Facebook. We reached 190,000 people as of 4 or 5 days ago. It's important to us, though, that when we talk about training with remote collars, that we're very accurate about what these collars can do, what they can't do, and quite frankly, we'll talk a little bit about how these collars can be misused. The people that are so adamant about trying to get remote collars banned, or the people that are all positive dog trainers, have probably never in their life trained a dog with a modern electric collar. These people rely on emotion, and quite frankly, they don't rely on facts. They'll twist the facts around and try and use their twisted idea of remote collar training to say that that's how all dog trainers work, and that's not the way it is. So the purpose for this little video is really to talk about the facts of how collars are used, and I'll bring up some things on why collar training in the past really wasn't very good training, and I can speak from experience there. I also want to mention that a couple months ago I wrote an article titled The Problem with All Positive Dog Trainers. Now I'm going to put the URL on the screen right now so you can go and read it. You can watch the video that we did on it. I'm not going to revisit that subject right now, but it plays into a lot of what we have to talk about in training dogs with remote collars. So I'm 67 years old and I've been training dogs very seriously for over 50 years. Back in 1978, I bought my first remote collar. It was a Tritronics Pro 100. I paid $1,000 for it. It was a pretty primitive remote collar. I'll be honest, those old collars from back in the 1970s and the 1980s, they put the shock in shock collars, or they put the electric in electric collars. They were difficult to work with, to say the least. Those, like my Pro 100, for me to change the stimulation level on the collar, I had to physically take the collar off the dog's neck, pull a plug out of the collar, and put a different plug into the collar, and then put it back on the dog's neck. You could not use those collars the way we train dogs today with collars. Back then, there was no such thing as low-level stimulation. We basically used collars to punish a dog for incorrect or non-compliance behavior. The way to train back then was to stimulate the dog and teach the dog that it could turn the stimulation off through compliance. And an example of that would be you would take a long line and put it on a dog and stimulate the dog and pull the dog to a dog crate, and as soon as it got into the dog crate, you would turn the stimulation level off. It was pretty barbaric training as far as I was concerned. This could get pretty ugly. In fact, in my opinion, it was pretty ugly even when it was going right. You had to have perfect timing. I didn't have perfect timing back then. Very few people that start to train with remote collars had perfect timing, but you needed to have perfect timing to make that system work. People could make it work. I couldn't. I didn't like what it did to my dogs, quite frankly. I stopped using remote collars for most of the 1980s. I walked away from it because I didn't like the concept of how that training was done. I didn't go back and start to use remote collars until the 1990s when this new breed of remote collars came out. And that was where we could change the level of stimulation at the transmitter rather than at the collar on the dog's neck. The problem used to be in the 70s and 80s, if you were training with one level of stimulation on a dog and you saw, well, this isn't high enough for what we want to do right now, I have to go to a higher level. So you'd take the collar off the dog's neck, put a plug in, put it back on the dog's neck, and the next level higher would be too high for the dog. So what are you going to do? You're going to abuse your dog. These new collars that came out in the 90s, where we can change the level of stimulation at the transmitter, allowed us to completely change the way we train dogs with remote collars. Today's collars, well, the old collars, like my old Pro 100, only had five levels of stimulation. Today's collars have 0 to 100. One brand has 0 to 127. That allows very fine tuning to how much stimulation you're going to give your dog during training. These new remote collars have allowed us to come up with what we call low-level stimulation training. And I'm going to be honest with you here that not all dogs react at low levels of stimulation, and I'll preface it by explaining what I'm talking about. On the educator collars, as Greg and I demonstrated, humans aren't going to feel stimulation levels until you get up in the area of level 15. And a lot of times we'll train dogs at level 8, 9, or 10. But some dogs have no reaction to the stimulation from a remote collar until they get to much higher levels, like level 30 or level 40. So that kind of reminded me of a seminar that I went to in 1982 or 1983, where it was a Tritronic seminar in Winnipeg, Canada. There were like 20 people at the seminar, and the instructor passed the remote collar around, and everybody had to put it on themselves and stimulate them. Now, there was one guy out of 20 that could take level 5. He could take it as high as it would go, and he barely felt it. That just blew my mind back then, because I just didn't understand that some people don't have the same reaction to stimulation that other people do. Dogs are the same way. A couple of days ago, I had an email from one of my customers, and she said, well, I have 3 dogs. 2 of my dogs are working perfectly. I have the training videos. I'm going through the foundation training with the dogs, but I think there's something wrong with the collar because my boxer doesn't react at all to the collar, and I've already gone up to level 30. Well, after talking with her, I said, you know, you're going to have to go higher than level 30. You don't have to go so high that you're causing the dog to verbalize, although he may verbalize when he feels it, because he doesn't understand what it's about. So dogs will sometimes, when they go through the foundation training, some dogs will verbalize. But they're not verbalizing because it hurts them. They're verbalizing because they don't understand what's going on. And you may need to take, I told this lady, you may need to take this dog to level 40 before he starts to show any kind of a reaction. And that dog is a perfect example of why we can't do a training video and tell you to start every dog at level 8 or 10, because that's not accurate. Some dogs have to go higher, which is one of the reasons we have to have a higher range on remote collars. When Greg Van Kuren and I did that video, the real purpose for the video was to get out in front of these animal extremists, and that's what I'll call them, or the all-positive dog trainers, on remote collars. We wanted to make sure that people understood that there was such a thing as low-level stimulation. There was such a thing as, these animal extremists think that in dog training, we people, myself included, that are reward-based trainers who apply corrections in dog training, they try and tell people that a correction is used to punish a dog, and that's incorrect. That's not correct. I said it in the video with Greg. In our opinion, the purpose of a correction is to get a behavior change. The purpose of a correction is not to punish a dog for bad behavior. We're looking for a behavior change, and we will use that behavior change and what causes that behavior change to modify our training and to develop our training. People that use corrections strictly to punish a dog lack experience in dog training, quite frankly. So there are times in our training when a dog is faced with a higher level of distraction where we'll tap them with a remote collar and low-level stimulation, and it's more like, hey, pay attention to me over here. You know, quit fooling around, quit looking over at this other dog, or whatever. But it's a low-level stimulation, and a lot of times that's all it takes for us to get a dog to refocus on us. That's the behavior change that we're looking for. We don't need to jack it up and push it for a high-level stimulation so the dog verbalizes. and then freaks out. That's bad dog training. That's using a dog training tool incorrectly in my mind. Now, it's also important too that new dog trainers understand that there are going to be times in training when a dog, the same dog you've been training all along at, say, a level 8, 9, or 10, there are going to be times when you're going to put that dog in an environment that has more distractions than the dog is used to. And at that point in time, you're going to have to increase the level of stimulation that you give this dog to get a behavior change. So just because you train a dog at level 10 all the time, if you take him down the street and there's a dog behind the fence and you can't get the dog to refocus on you, and you give him a watch command or a touch command or a look command, and you stimulate him with level 10, he's going to ignore it. You're going to have to turn that level up to the point where you get a behavior change, where the dog looks at you, you mark the look, yes or good or whatever you want to use, and that's the level you use at that point in time. So people that have never trained with a collar before have to understand that there are low-level stimulation levels for low distraction levels, and there are, as the dog gets higher in distraction levels, the odds are your level of stimulation is going to have to go higher to get a behavior change. The caveat here is that with repetition, with training, dog trainers are going to find out that their dogs are going to behave better more often and require less times when they have to have a higher level of stimulation. The dogs learn, hey, I have to mind. I've got the remote collar on and I have to mind, which basically brings me back to one other thing, because people will say, well, if I train with a remote collar, am I going to reach a point where I can take the collar off? Or will he have to use it the rest of his life? Now, there's two roads that you can go down with that. I tell people, you know, I worked for 10 years as a police canine handler. When I took my police dog out, he put the remote collar on all the time, every time I took him out. But I may only have ever touched the transmitter once in 20 deployments, but it was there for the emergencies, for when I needed it. There's the other road that competition dog trainers will go down, where they want to reach a point where their dog will work without having the remote collar on. And that can happen. That can happen in certain environments and certain levels of distraction. And I'm not going to go into training for that here. We have our remote collar videos that cover that. But the option is there for that to happen for those trainers that want to get to that point. My feeling is if you're a pet dog trainer, this is my feeling now, if you're a pet dog trainer and you have a dog that you think you need to get control under, and you don't have 110% faith in that dog minding you all the time, why not put the collar on? Why not put the collar on every single time you take him outside? You're just playing with Mother Nature to forget it, or to walk away from it and not have it there for the emergencies that may pop up. I also want to talk about using remote collars to extinguish a behavior. And what would that be? Well, I'll use the example of a dog that chases squirrels or a dog that chases rabbits. For you to extinguish that behavior in a dog, you're going to have to go to a high level of stimulation, very high. You may not ever extinguish it, to be totally truthful, but if you do want to try and extinguish it, it's going to have to be high, and it may have to be high enough that your dog is going to verbalize or yelp when you jack it up that high. So I'm not going to go into the steps on how to do that. I'm just saying that there are some behaviors that need to be extinguished in dogs, and it usually occurs because a dog has been allowed to practice that bad behavior again and again and again in the past. So when you reach a point where you say, okay, enough is enough, I'm going to stop this, then you have to extinguish that behavior, and you're going to have to use much higher levels of stimulation than you would have had to use had you started right from the very beginning as a young dog. You could have probably changed that dog's behavior with much lower levels of stimulation. This brings us to the subject of dogs that verbalize when they have a remote collar on and the level of stimulation is too high. I'm not going to kid anybody by saying that remote collar training and low-level stimulation training is not avoidance training. It is avoidance training. Corrections are aversives. So those people that don't take the time to take their dogs through the conditioning phase of training, or they move through that conditioning phase too fast, and they get their dogs at a level that's too high for that dog, there's a good chance that some dogs that are screamers are going to verbalize and they're going to yelp. As a general rule, dogs that do that do it because the handler has got them working at too high of a level. And through training, they may work up to that level. Through training, they may go higher, but in the beginning, if the dog doesn't know what's going on, if he hasn't been properly conditioned to it, they're going to verbalize. Which brings me to talk about the conditioning phase of using a remote collar. I'm not going to talk about how to train the conditioning phase, but I want to explain here that what conditioning is. Basically what it is we pair the remote collar to a leash correction. And we only use corrections for behaviors that the dog absolutely knows but refuses to comply with. So in the conditioning phase, we don't apply corrections until the dog knows the behavior and refuses to do it. And when we decide to condition a remote collar, we add the remote collar stimulation to a leash correction, with the goal being that the dog understands at the end of training that the stimulation from a remote collar comes from me and not from something else in the environment. We want the dog, when we correct the dog, to know that the correction comes from us. That's how they're going to modify their behavior. I should point out that when the conditioning phase is not done correctly, it's pretty common for dogs to develop superstitious behavior when they get stimulated and they don't understand what the stimulation is coming from. And what is superstitious behavior? Well, your dog could be standing next to a tree when you stimulate them, and they think that the stimulation came from the tree. Or it could be standing next to the mailbox or the garbage can, and they think stimulation came from that garbage can, and they don't want to ever go back near that garbage can. That's superstitious association with a remote collar. And our goal in training, in the conditioning phase, is not to have a lot of superstitious behavior. We don't want that. And we cover that in the DVDs that we produced, how to get around, how to get around that. I mean, I have used remote collars incorrectly before I knew how to do it. And when you do it wrong, and there's not a tree or a post or a garbage can around, the dog thinks he just stepped on a landmine, and they jump and they look at the ground because they don't know where it came from. A good conditioning program eliminates that. So to better understand how these remote collars work, if I had to compare them to something, I would compare them to a TENS unit or an EMS unit that physical therapists use. And if you've ever had an injury, when I was young, I used to throw my knees out of joint a lot. I ended up having a lot of physical therapy. And you can get, a physical therapist will put these TEMS units on you, and they'll pass a current through the unit that will contract your muscles. In this case, we'll do it on my arm. Now I can feel that. If you can see my arm jumping here, there's no pain going on at all. And this is exactly the same kind of stimulation that we're going to get with a remote collar on a dog. Now I can ramp this up so it really makes my arm twitch. There's absolutely no pain here. Now I'll say this, that my son Jeff produced the one video where he put a remote collar on his neck, and it was an educator collar, and he turned it up to 100. And he stimulated himself a number of times. He didn't scream or yelp. because he knew what was going to happen. So if I'd have taken that same collar and put it on a dog that didn't understand what was going to happen, like Jeff said, there was no pain there. But if we would have put that on a dog and put it on 100, that dog is going to startle, and some dogs are going to yelp because they don't know what's going to happen. But if we can take our dogs through a proper conditioning phase where we pair the stimulation from the remote collar to a leash correction, and a dog only gets a leash correction for refusing to do things that it absolutely 100% knows the meaning of a command. In other words, we don't correct a dog until the dog knows what a command is and he refuses to do it. You know, when we can then pair the leash correction with a remote collar, we want the dog to understand that this stimulation is coming from us, the handler, okay? When he knows that, and he knows that he's going to get corrected because you're consistent in the way you handle the dog, and he knows he's going to get corrected, and he gets stimulation from a remote collar, they accept it. They don't verbalize usually once they understand that. And it just doesn't, there's no pain here at all. Now I'm going to increase it even a little higher. So that's, for this, that's the highest level that it goes. And it's a pretty good comparison for what a remote collar does too. Because what it does, what the remote collars, the educator remote collars, stimulate the muscles in the dog's neck. That's why when you see the neck muscles on a dog twitch, this is what you're seeing right here. You're seeing the stimulation. You're seeing the stimulation of the muscles. And it doesn't mean that there's any pain there. It's important that people understand that. So there's one last thing that I do want to talk about. You hear people say how remote collars burn a dog's neck. That is absolutely false. It doesn't happen. Remote collars don't burn the dog's neck. What happens is when a collar is put on too loose, the probes will rub on the skin and cause irritation. When a collar is left on a dog too long, the probes can cause irritation to the neck. Remote collars are not designed to be worn nonstop all the time. You take the dog out, you put it on, you come home, you take the remote collar off the dog. So when people say, oh, this thing burned my dog's neck, they didn't burn the neck. So the reason that we did this video is so that we could get out in front of all the animal rights people and all of the all-positive dog trainers that are out there trying to tell people that remote collars should be banned. People like myself, people that are professional dog trainers, people that are competitors, people that train hunting dogs, they need to get in front of these animal rights people. And they need to stand up, because that didn't happen in England. That didn't happen in Australia, where they've banned these tools. Any tool can be abused. I don't care if it's a leash, I don't care if it's a prong collar, I don't care if it's a choke collar. Any dog training tool can be abused. And to ban a tool because some people abuse them is just wrong. We have to get in front of that whole movement and educate people that these things, when they're used properly, are the greatest dog training tool that's ever been invented. And that's why I asked in the first video that, you know, if you're a dog trainer, if you make your living from training other people's dogs, or if you're a competitor, I say go out there and produce a short little video on remote collars and put them on yourself to show people that it doesn't have to hurt. Show people that when these tools are used correctly, they're great dog training tools. And if you hear of people like the vice president of the AKC, who recently got on Fox News and talked about how terrible these remote collars are, I will guarantee you this woman has never trained a dog with a modern remote collar. She doesn't have a clue about what she's talking about. So we have to get in front of people like this and do things like I'm doing here today, like Greg and I did. And we need to stand up and say, hey, we're going to train dogs very humanely. We love our dogs, we don't abuse our dogs, and we're going to use the tools we think we need to make our dogs a good member of our society and of our family.